Welcome back to part 4 of our Unit 0 Science Practices videos. This is going to be our video on experimental methodology. At the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following questions. What are the basic elements of experimental methodology? And can you identify experimental design components when evaluating research? Throughout this video, we are going to be using one research question as kind of our example that we can use to explain the different parts of an experiment. The question is going to be, what are the effects of a new herbal tea? The first part of our experiment will be to create a hypothesis. Again, our hypothesis is going to be some sort of guess on what we think is going to happen. This should be educated, it should be falsifiable, and it should be testable. So our hypothesis is going to be participants who drink the herbal tea daily for 4 weeks will show at least 30% reduction in depressive symptoms compared to the baseline, while those who drink a placebo will see no change. This hypothesis is testifiable, right? We can test to see whether or not that herbal tea has shown a reduction in depressive symptoms. This is also falsifiable because we can prove it wrong. We can prove that there isn't at least 30% reduction in the depressive symptoms. So our hypothesis has to be both testable and falsifiable. The next part of our experimental research is going to be to determine the variables. These variables are going to come directly from our hypothesis. So these are the things that we are actually testing. An independent variable, or IV, is going to be what the researcher manipulates. My way to remember this is the letter I at the beginning. I change something. So independent variable is what I change. So in this case, we are changing whether or not someone drinks herbal tea. So our independent variable is if they drink the herbal tea or not. The dependent variable is going to be what is measured after that independent variable is manipulated. In this case, it's going to be our depressive symptoms. When we are carrying out research, we do need to be aware of confounding variables. Confounding variables are outside factors that might influence that dependent variable. So in our study, some examples of confounding variables might be the diet that the person already has, maybe the sleep that they get, the medication that they're on, any therapy that they're in, other social factors, their education level. All of these things could potentially influence the amount of depressive symptoms that someone shows. And so as a researcher, it's important for us to be aware of those. The next thing we have to talk about is operational definitions. We've talked about this before, but I really want to stress that this is very, very important. It will always end up on the AP FRQ. So you definitely want to make sure that you are understanding operational definitions. Operational definitions are the specific, precise definitions of the variables in our study and the processes within our studies. Again, operational definitions make things measurable and manageable. So if our independent variable is the herbal tea, how can we make that manageable or measurable? So things that we might consider: what specific type of herbal tea are they drinking? How much of the herbal tea are they going to eat? When are the participants drinking that herbal tea? All of those things we have to be very precise about because they could potentially influence the result of our study. For our dependent variable, our variable is depressive symptoms. For this particular study, we're going to have to be aware of the specific type of depressive symptoms that we're looking at, the length that those symptoms happen, the intensity of the symptoms. All of those things are super important to be precise about when we are measuring how often that person is experiencing that symptom. An example for this particular study could be maybe a score on a mood scale. After we have developed our hypothesis and we figured out our variables and operationally defined our variables, now it's important for us to actually gather our participants for the study. The idea of sampling was talked about in a previous video, so I'm not going to go over each of these terms again. But I do want you to be aware that sampling is a very important part of the research process and especially important for an experiment. So rather than defining all of these terms again, I am going to give you some tips when you're looking at a research study, when you're thinking about the sample. One of the things that you're going to have to do is really think about, is this experiment or this research study actually telling me what I want it to tell me? And some of the things that you're going to look at is, who is the population? So if you're looking at a research study that has only men in their population, then that can't be generalized to women. What's the size of the sample? Too small of a sample could lead to a lack of generalization. And then finally, was there any sort of bias when choosing the sample? If you're using opportunity sampling or convenience sampling, that sample might have some bias in it. And so we might need to take that into account when we are applying the findings of the research. After we have gathered our participants for the study, now we need to group our participants into either the experimental group or the control group. So remember, our independent variable is going to be herbal tea, whether or not the person is drinking herbal tea. We now need to put our participants into two different groups. The group that's going to drink the herbal tea and the group that is not going to drink the herbal tea. We call these two groups our experimental group and our control group. Our experimental group is going to be the group that receives the independent variable. So the group that is drinking the herbal tea. The control group is going to be our baseline. This is who we are comparing the experimental group to. They are not receiving the independent variable. We have a control group for a reason. We have it so that we can make sure that it is actually the independent variable, the herbal tea, that is making the difference in the dependent variable, the depressive moods. In order to put people into the experimental and control groups, we do need to use random assignment. And random assignment is when we are allocating people to either group based on chance. Every person should have an equal chance of being in either group. This is super important. If we do not have random assignment, we cannot consider the study a true experiment. So let's go to our example that we've been using for the herbal tea. Our experimental group in our example of the effects of herbal tea is the group that drinks the herbal tea. The control group is going to be the group that receives the placebo tea. A placebo is a substance that is given to a control group that has no therapeutic effect. We would give them a separate tea or a tea that has no effects. One of the things that we do have to be aware of is the placebo effect. The placebo effect is when we see a person's physical or mental health actually improve after taking a placebo because they feel like they're actually receiving the treatment. So in this case, we might see an overall improvement in people's depressive moods, regardless of if they have the herbal tea or the placebo. So that is something to keep in mind when we are doing experiments. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of blinding our study. Other variables may impact our experiment. And so one of the things that we do is we use either the single blind or double blind procedure to avoid experimenter bias. So a single blind procedure is when the researcher knows who is in each treatment group. So who is in the experimental group, who's getting the tea, and who is in the control group, getting the placebo. The double blind experiment is when neither the researcher nor the participants know which group they are in. So the researcher also wouldn't know if the person is getting a placebo tea or the regular herbal tea. This is to avoid the experimenter bias. An experimenter bias is the unintentional influence that a researcher might have on the study because they know who is in each group. The researcher might unintentionally treat one group differently because they know that that person is getting the herbal tea. And so we use the single and double blind procedures to avoid bias or other variables that might come into play here. After we have established our procedures for our experiments, then we're actually ready to carry out the experiment. So we'll have our participants drink the tea or the placebo for a certain number of weeks, and then we'll measure their depressive moods before and after. After we've actually carried out our procedure, we'll gather all the data and we will analyze that data later on. We will talk about how we analyze data in another video, but this is another important step when it comes to the experimental method. So after the procedure is done, gather all the data, analyze it. After we've analyzed that data, the researcher will write up an experimental report, share it with their colleagues for peer review, and then finally publish the data.